In my last two videos, we talked about the top running backs and the top wide receivers in this year's fantasy draft. For this video, we'll talk about the tight ends. Before we do though, let's go over the rules so that we're all on the same page. Each of these videos will be based on a 12-team league that features half-point PPR scoring. The roster that I'll be using will be the one listed at the top. A quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, flex, a kicker, and a defense. If you have different settings than the ones listed for this video, check out my link below. I have a number of downloadable guides with all the formats listed on your screen. Alright, let's talk about tier 1, and for this video, I only see one player. We have Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. Objectively, he's your number 1 tight end this year, and I currently have him going for over 1,400 total yards. I think he's going to have another killer season. Based on his relative value, I have no problem spending a mid to late first round pick in your 12-team draft. Again, you don't get this much upside with a tight end, so don't feel bad taking him with a top tier pick. Now, for tier 2, we have the following 2 players. I have George Kittle and Darren Waller. Both these guys offer a lot of upside and can be easily taken at the end of the second round. If you get one of the coveted top 4 running backs this year, go ahead and grab one of these tight ends in your round 2. There's so much value at the wide receiver spot this year that you can always grab one later. The one thing I'm going to watch out for though is the health of Darren Waller. He's currently sitting out practices, and I really hope he'll be okay for the coming season. That's definitely something to keep an eye on. Let's move on to tier 3. In this tier, we have Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, and TJ Hawkinson. It seems like Mark Andrews is going a lot lower than I expected. Last year, he missed 2 games, and he still managed to create 700 yards and 7 touchdowns. I actually have him going for over 800 yards this year at a similar rate and also getting roughly 8 scores. Taking him in the middle of the 4th is completely okay in my books. Now, for Kyle Pitts, he's a very interesting player. He's a rookie that was a top 4 pick in the NFL draft, and I think he's due for a pretty big season. However, some of the projections that people have given him are honestly a little bit ridiculous. If he goes for 800 yards, for example, that's a really good season for a rookie. I've seen other projections that have him breaking 1,000, and yes, he's in a heavy throwing offense, and yes, Julio Jones is not on his team, but once again, we need to be realistic. I just don't think he's going to break every single rookie record this season. I do think he has that upside in the future, but I'm not banking on that for my fantasy draft. Grabbing him in round 5 seems like the move for me. Moving on, let's talk about tier 4. I see a good amount of value in this tier. For example, Tyler Higbee seems to be the forgotten tight end in this year's draft. The Rams don't have Gerald Everett anymore, so I think he's aligned for a pretty good season. If he ends up getting 600 or 700 receiving yards with Matt Stafford throwing the ball, I think that's pretty fair. He's a guy that I'm targeting pretty heavily simply based on that value. The other guy that I think is pretty interesting is Robert Tonyan. It's going to be hard for him to repeat the double-digit touchdowns, but a stat line of 600 yards and 6 touchdowns, that seems pretty reasonable. Finally, let's talk about tier 5. Now, as you see on your screen, there are a number of players that fit the bill for undervalued in this year's draft. I do understand that none of these players are your high-value targets, but for me, and if I'm desperately looking at this tier, I'm more or less looking for good matchups. Mike Gesicki and Hunter Henry, if he's healthy of course, he could have big games depending on who they face. For example, the Jets are in their division and their secondary is pretty bad. These are good rotational players simply for that reason. Now, generally speaking, tight ends are one of the most difficult positions to fill this season. Unless you swing early at your top 3 guys, it might be more prudent to wait until tier 4 and just run with a weak position. I think there is so much more value in the wide receiver and running back positions that I don't want to have to pay a premium for an average tight end. For me, this will probably end up meaning that I'm going to draft a guy like Tyler Higbee, and I'm just going to hope for the best. Regardless, this position should give you a general guide on this position, and I really hope you gain some value. In my next video, we'll talk about my favorite quarterbacks, and that's going to wrap up the series. Again, these rankings are available in Excel on my Patreon. Also, do me a favor and like and subscribe to the channel below, as well as follow me on Twitter at SamuelRGold.